So, welcome to this session, guys. This is a session celebrating Jack Oliva Rendler, the author and instructor, who has released his new book, Terrestrial Architecture. And to give you a brief introduction about Jack is exploring work processes in digital 3D modeling, geospatial information, GIS, and algorithmic modeling methods for multi-scalar modeling solutions. So Jack attended the SCI-Arc, Southern California Institute of Architecture, where he won an undergrad thesis prize. He also received a master's degree in architecture from Harvard, GSD, and Jack's thesis projects at both institutions proposed radical data infrastructures for Earth observation science and environmental analysis. In 2018, he received an award from Mars City Design, an urban design category in the Mars City Design Competition with panelists and judges from NASA and Dassault. So Jack has worked with the renowned architecture firms around the world, such as Morphologies, MAD, and Gensler. His book, Terrestrial Architecture, that we're going to learn more about through the session today, was published on Jan 29th, 2024. The book speaks to new paradigms in architecture as the subject of our designs become ecological and environmental. The book examines biological, computational, and geometrical systems with integrated multi-layered theories about how environment will be designed in the future. In today's talk, Jack will introduce us the overall framework of the book, its main components, and how they work together. We will discuss the terms biosphere, ecology, and environment to understand the natural world in an intricate way. We'll be talking about algorithmic tool sets and the potentials they offer to architecture as generative methods for design. We will be looking at geospatial tools and cyber infrastructures as a means to map and model environments, giving us better comprehension into the inner workings of our natural world. Included in the lecture are explorations of morphological constructs that give insight into knowledge, architecture, and organic or mechanical process. And as an in-depth thesis, Jack will introduce the book as a framework for environmental and planetary design. So without further ado, I hand it over to Jack. And once again, thanks a lot for joining us, guys. And we will keep the floors open. Please feel free to come in. And make sure to gather all your questions. We want this to be an interactive session. So once Jack gives his presentation, we will open the floor for an exciting conversation. All right. Yeah, with that being said, I won't take too long. Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vamsi. I'm super grateful to the Futurely team. They are my brothers, my comrades, my colleagues in architecture around the world. So much inspiration has been shared online and through Instagram, through online courses, sharing different methodologies for design. The Futurely platform is really amazing, and some other fellow colleagues are here, and I'm just super grateful that we can all uh, celebrate this accomplishment together, this movement forward with the work that I feel like we're working on together, which is really great. So I'm just super grateful to Futurely, Arik and Vamsi. I want to thank you guys. Grateful. I want to send out more thank yous. So thank you to my editor, Jill, and book designer, Rick, my parents. Actually, a lot of these ideas came from working with my parents. They're both architects. Everyone here is sharing in a very monumental moment for me. This is a lot of work culminating in a book. So, uh, work in school, work with different organizations. So I worked with Metabolic Studio. Big thank you to Lauren Bond. Some people contributed to the book. Um, the Paul Rudolph Institute for Modern Architecture allowed me to use an image from Paul Rudolph officially, which was very special. Zaha Hadid Architects let me use one of Zaha Hadid's paintings, which is also very special. Um, Graham Harmon, one of my professors, contributed a quote about the book. Same with Stuart Cohen from the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and a friend of mine, Benjamin Pollack, um, Very grateful for him and Martin Weinstein from the Open Earth Foundation. So there are many contributions to this book, and I'm thankful to everyone. Um, so I'll start sharing my screen. Um, how's this looking? This PowerPoint. I assume everyone can see its screen too, so
It's super clear.
okay. Um, yeah, so this is the cover with a few quotes from contributors. Um, I'm trying to talk in a more organic way and not read too much from the book. The more structured sort of format of writing can be found in the book. So I'll start with just describing the parts of the book and how the different ideas work together, the overall framework. The beginning of the book is comprehensions of natural systems or reality. So it goes into reflections about ecology and the biosphere, geochemistry, um, and philosophy about biology and nature, fractals and architecture. Um, one moment. Okay. And then, so that's the sort of the sort of leading up to laying down the context for the book is the biosphere or the natural systems. And then the natural systems become legible through um, computation. Computational tools allow us to have a better understanding of what's happening within ecologies or environments. Um, looking at cybernetics, cyber infrastructures, which are like remote sensing devices, satellites that analyze environments, um, take photographs of environments, photographs of the Earth. So we'll go into in-depth theories about computation, and these cyber infrastructure tools. Um, and then a little bit about geometry, which the Futurely platform is famous for these morphological explorations. So starting with like sort of a basis context for all of architecture or all urban design is this concept of the biosphere, which is a term developed by the Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, and he wanted to combine sort of geophysics, geochemistry, with biology to have a sort of theory about um, biology as a whole at a planetary scale. So we came up with the term biosphere to describe this layer around the Earth, which would be sort of describing the nature of all life forms. So he talked about solar radiation as this energy system that would define the morphological construct for all organisms. So in this flower I drew from Kauai, the flower is growing in response to the sun, also in response to the terrain, and it's this mitigation of vectors and forces in response to the energy conditions of the biosphere climate. So it's responding to the sun, it's responding to water, it's responding to ground nutrition. So there's a basis and a context for um, sort of how each organism is growing in response to their environment. Vernadsky also talked about the multiplication of organisms. All organisms are going to multiply exponentially or reproduce and sort of diffuse and spread across the planet. Um, and the decomposition of these organic matters is what creates oil. So there's this planetary energy system at play that based on organic and biologic material. The respiratory system of organisms is defining the atmosphere, and also the rate of multiplication. So the slower these organisms are breathing, the slower they're reproducing. Uh, really small organisms like phytoplankton could cover the earth very quickly, in a matter of day or two if nothing were to oppose their reproduction process. And he also talked about cyclical energy systems, cyclical systems. So there's always a recycling process, so no energy is wasted in nature. So the book goes very deep into these biological systems. I wanted to give an oversight of biology and share these beautiful images. One of them is from Orcas Island, Washington. The other one is from the Redwood Forest in Santa Cruz. Um, and yeah, so I wanted to prefix the presentation with this short snippet about biology, and then go into this planetary narrative about multiple ecologies that are interacting around the globe. Um, so there's this resource extraction and trade dynamic happening at the planetary scale. These are wisping lines that describe trade routes, bringing resources from the Amazon, different mines around the world, and then they're arriving at these major metropolises. So the main point here is that each location along the supply chain is an ecology, and these ecologies are interlinked. They're connected to each other. And this is an important, I'll be talking about this concept of interconnectivity among sort of um, beings, entities, societies, and how this creates sort of a global framework for energy exchange and a context for architecture. Each ecology is a new subject for design. I'll be talking about how these ecologies can actually be mapped and modeled and worked upon through geospatial tools, and multiple models and maps can describe how they're related to each other. So there's resource extraction points in yellow, transportation grids in red, which we're very zoomed out, so we can't see the transportation grids. But and then the shipping routes in white wisping lines. So from a terrestrial scale, planetary scale, continental scale, we can see networks of cities connected to each other. And it's important to look at this as a continuous uh, cellular phenomena of cities that are connected in this vast network and energy exchange. Um, and it's cellular. And you could even describe biology in terms of its algorithms, which is the image on the right. Um, so I wanted to show these three images together. We have the algorithmic um, uh, modeling of a tree, which came from Morgan Gerard, my friend at SciArc. This is his swarm tree project. These are Earth observation uh, photographs of the Earth at night from space, and this is a GIS map of New York. Um, so you have this concept of the Anthropocene where humans have an impact on their environment. We are shifting the terrestrial reality of the Earth, so it's important we start adopting design techniques which relate to the Earth, its nature, and how we are able to have an impact on these systems. Um, so the concept of a cellular fractal uh, morphology is becomes super important because at every it's multi-scalar and it performs in similar ways at very small scales and very large scale. Um, there's also a history in architecture of megastructures. This is an image of Paul Rudolph, where the architecture starts to become environmental, this sort of infinite vista, this infinite perspective, and light is penetrating from above into the depth of the space. You can imagine this is a very well lit space uh, with volumetric light as capable of becoming a garden. This sort of cellular structure from Conrad Waxman, space frame structure, becomes like early prototypes for environmental design. Buckminster Fuller was also really interested in the space frame structures, and these type of modular frameworks for construction allow the architecture to diffuse, adapt, mutate, evolve, um, and achieve all sorts of performance criteria. Um, so it's also thinking about the universe at its multiple scales, looking at this James image from the James Webb Telescope and an image of a biological cell, this fractal nature of the universe and these mathematical principles that define the sort of structure of matter. And so looking at like in-depth fractal architecture models, we're able to create environments using mathematical formulas, which is something that parametricism has talked about, and something that's just going to be more and more prevalent as we use AI and algorithmic tools. We can generate these environments. And there's something to be said about how cities formulate today with a bit more chaos, and then how fractal math mathematical forms sort of arrive in a very harmonious, composed way. Um, each component of the city is inter interoperable with itself in a harmonic way, in a composed way, in a sort of disciplined way. Um, this image on the left was by a collaboration between me, myself, and a futurely colleague, Moomin. Um, I believe he's in Austria. Um, and this image on the right's another image from the Fractal Architecture collection. Essentially, I was able to take multiple formulas, stitch them together, and create something that resembled a city. And I thought this was super important for the the concept that we'll be able to build cities and design environments using parametric tools, algorithmic tools, and create a sort of cohesive model for the city um, using these algorithmic tool sets. So there's a way in which fractal architecture also relates to sort of sacred architecture, like the Mayan pyramids, or the pyramids of Giza, or Angkor Wat. They all used sacred geometry or mathematical proportions that were harmonious to be able to generate their architecture. Uh, um, so there's a certain way in which fractal architecture allows us to connect to infinity, also connect to concepts, connect to that deep essence of the universe, which is eternal in nature. We sort of connect to that concept through these infinite architectures that have infinite detail and also aggregate, mutate, adapt, and expand infinitely. On the right is Versailles, uh, a drawing of Versailles garden and a garden architecture, and on the left is a magnetic field parametric geometry. So again, looking at how cities or architecture can be formed by these schematic um, geometries or these abstract geometries. When I was at Harvard, one of my professors on my review called it prototypical abstract geometry. And then there's all these potentials in which abstract geometry could be applied um, using parametric tools or algorithmic tools to generate these abstract geometries. They can be used for schematic for cities in a very traditional sense. But they could also, fractal mathematics can also be used to generate these sort of large terrestrial landscapes. Um, this is a dimensional elevation map of the continent North America, looking at the Sierra Nevadas here. Um, so there's all these potentials for modeling and mapping that come from these mathematical tool sets and how they allow us to design and model environments. And then from another perspective, we have remote sensing technology, um, like satellites and drones, different different vehicles or devices that function remotely that allow us to scan the Earth and map the Earth, creating different images that give us information about what's happening in the environment. So on the right is this soil erosion map, and on the left is this LiDAR model of Chicago. And so contextually, we have all these new ways of generating models of environments, which is so valuable as we begin to expand the scope of architecture to become environmental and ecological. There's a whole streamlined infrastructure, a geospatial repository, and uh, sort of even like a data supply chain that can generate these environmental models and contextual models. And it started with photographing the Earth from space. This is the history of it. This is the V2 rocket, the first ever photograph of the Earth from space. Um, this is an image of Beijing on the left and Cape Canaveral on the right. And what's big, a big movement happening right now is with AI to be able to use machine learning to interpret different features within these aerial photographs and translate the features within the photographs into model format. So these are all technical workflows to become more familiar, intimately understanding the phenomena that's happening within the built and natural environment. And these tools are going to come online in more standardized and familiar ways. And we are going to have more and more authorship and agency as we transform our planet. So it's important that we have a sense of, humility and some philosophical, spiritual, grounded um, context as we start to augment these terrestrial realities, these city architectures. And so community becomes very important, inner-centeredness. Um, so we're looking at a map of Los Angeles and looking at the different communities within the Los Angeles basin. This is Watts right here, Pico Union. Um, this is an area surrounding Metabolic Studio where I was working, and essentially a large context map like Los Angeles, a huge basin can be broken apart into these discernible pieces, these smaller scale maps, and then looked at in taxonomies of layers on how each of these communities is functioning. Um, and so each of these communities come together and form the greater whole, right? So this is part of a process I developed with my father called virtual community action planning, where each community will have a digital twin or virtual model that they can develop and work on and determine their own interventions, participate in the transformation of their community. So it'd start with a map like this, which shows commercial corridors, institutional locations, educational locations, a programmatic map of social use within the urban fabric that could also be 3D. And then it's interesting how a multiplicity of these models start to stitch together to form larger environmental models, or also you can see how multiple projects fit into a context like this. Looking at how the context of how a school fits in with the commercial space around it, or how much green space there is, or how institutions play a certain role in their community. You could also parse and pull apart these environmental models into multiple layers, streetscape, parcels, and sort of urban massing and educational locations. So looking at each red zone node within the network uh, as a social program, or a place of community, a place of education, a place of gathering for uh, community essentially, which could be connected by green infrastructure. So on the left is a map of Watts, and then what does a schematic community intervention look like within that space? You could sketch over it or use parametric tools. This is like the groundwork of what could become a more parametric model. And then zooming out from the community scale to the terrestrial scale, this is the continent of North America, with this massive watershed, the Colorado River watershed, 250,000 square miles. I know we're on an international call and would like to hear it in kilometers, but I have it in terms of miles. Um, so on the left, we have Los Angeles, where 50% of the water comes from the Colorado River. On the right, we have Denver, where 50% of the water comes from the Colorado River. Um, we have 15 anywhere from 12 to 15 cities that are using electricity from the Colorado River and gathering water from the Colorado River also. So this is a massive infrastructure project that I explored at Metabolic Studio, and it's common now around the world that we have these massive infrastructure projects at a terrestrial scale. And often in educational practice in architecture schools, we're looking at sort of we're not quite thinking at this scale. And the interoperability between scales, which is so important. You know, what's the relationship between the community scale and these larger terrestrial scales? These geospatial models allow us to work in an intimate way across these scales and allow us to better, care for these natural systems. Um, these are more maps of the same terrestrial infrastructural phenomena. So when I start talking about how these ecologies are connected to each other, you could see how resources are extracted from the Amazon, brought along the coast of South America, um, stopping in countries here and brought up to Los Angeles into the San Pedro Harbor, and then um, shipped around the earth globally. I mean, nationally in the US. So the Amazon is inextricably linked to the phenomena happening in Los Angeles, which is this resource consumption site, which is also linked to the Colorado River Basin. So on the left here in the bottom left corner, we have um, Los Angeles, and then this massive ecology that Los Angeles is linked to at a Earth scale. Um, so I imagine, you know, a constellation of models like this is going to require certain platforms to manage all these different terrestrial phenomena that are happening at multiple scales, multiple models of communities, multiple models of ecologies. We're going to have platforms, maybe social network platforms or interfaces that allow us to see the interdependency between these ecologies and environments at these different scales. And that's so critically important as we um, have a certain agency and responsibility to care for the environment. So this was my first attempt at designing a data infrastructure, a cyber infrastructure, my thesis project at SciArc, where this infrastructural building would house data of Earth systems. So as a framework of galleries and libraries and archive spaces, which I later called an instrument of terrestrial transformation, which would house this Earth system data. Um, and it would also sort of have solar panels, vibrating panels that would generate energy. It would be this micro ecosystem of information and data, and also house artificial intelligence entities that would assist in data analysis and participate in sort of the creative process of environmental systems. Um, so this is a render looking at the data infrastructure project, a cross section of a tower through the space. And then later I refined the data infrastructure project into this instrument of terrestrial transformation thesis project at Harvard, where things were a bit more organized and consolidated into this symmetrical framework, where on one side you would have hydrology, geology, biology organized in one institutional framework on the left, and then you would have the design disciplines or urban design, city planning, architecture on the other side. And that would create this informational framework, which would be a context for design. Um, you'd be able to design in context to hydrological information, geological data, and biospheric information. And this would kind of spatialize that relationship. So this is from this concept of a knowledge architecture. This is Tatiana from Complexity Graphics. She created these diagrams to talk about the recursivity in mathematics and music with certain intervals and periodic structures that exist within music. And in the book Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, he actually talks about these mathematical harmonies in Bach's composition as the origin for artificial intelligence, the origin of knowledge architecture, the origins of computation. Computation is essentially, advanced calculation, um, advanced mathematics. So I started thinking about the harmony of knowledge aggregation in space, which deals with incompleteness and completeness. This is Solowit's incomplete cube and how things are aggregated and stitched together in different components of a complete whole. So this applies to the environmental scale of sort of incomplete models and complete models and how they're aggregated within mo model space or within different knowledge architectures. Um, so this next part of the lecture is going to go into these geometrical frameworks following complexity graphics, visualizations of music. We start moving into morphology and geometry as this abstract potential to not only create knowledge architecture, organizing information, but also be responsive to ecologies and environments. So when Zaha Hadid makes an abstract painting, it's has these abstract lines and colors, vectors. We have certain terminologies to describe what's happening within the image. She is she's able to give a certain prototype of a city using abstract geometry. And abstract geometry could also be used for knowledge architectures, but the potential of this abstract geometrical space is something I've thought quite a bit about. And then also how geometry ends up relating to a landscape or to a terrestrial system in a very basic, primitive sense with Hadrian's Villa. Um, maybe, we don't build palaces that create great views into the surrounding environment, but we create sort of a palace for all, or um, what are the more intelligent ways to relate to a terrestrial system than for one person with views versus like a whole collective society and how they mitigate the energy with the biosphere system. But this was a certain uh, predecessor to Earth architectures because the architecture is relating to the landscape, with these certain axes relating to the topographical contours of the landscape. The architecture very directly inhabits and relates to the landscape. So a little more on prototypical abstract geometry with certain terminologies, we are able to become more fluent in how we can manipulate geometry in space. So looking at perspectival grids, the concept of perpendicular space, intersecting space, the concept of a tetrahedron that could be inscribed into a perspectival grid, surface normals as being perpendicular to surfaces. We're able to have a whole lexicon and vocabulary that allows us to transform and manipulate geometry in a much more deliberate way. Um, we're also looking at music still and how music could be translated into abstract geometry. These harmonic grids that I created were created by how a tetrahedron can be inscribed in a circle and how the circle could represent the scale of music. So if you have 12 notes in a scale in music and you have a circle that represents those 12 notes, um, like a clock, you could inscribe a tetrahedron that represents a chord within that circle, and then create a grid of circles and then a grid of chords, and start to create these alignments in space, these proportions of space. Um, So you start to have parallel lines, um, which are color coded in blue, these large axes which exist in red, and you get this aggregation of geometry, which um, could be used for urban systems or knowledge architecture. It becomes a constellation for composition, a constellation or a composition. Um, you could also think about mechanical systems as having certain abstract qualities that lend themselves to geometric transformation, looking at machine components, locks, engines that create these rotational systems, quantum computers, uh, these sort of these radial and axial geometries allowing the composition of space to happen in a mechanical sense, which I think works well for sort of knowledge architecture or aggregating how information works in space, kind of controlling the rate and intervals at which information travels through space. Um, and then crystallography as another prototypical abstract geometry, um, looks at these zones of symmetry, these color-coded frameworks for how the crystal grows. And then the crystal is used inside the quantum computer to define um, uh, rates and intervals of the transmission of information. So there's this concept of the architecture of the crystal is something I want to get even deeper into, besides just how this the crystal uses a morphogenetic field to define its transformation. The concept of the morphogenetic field is really big inside the book. There's a few pages written about it. It's this probability space that surrounds all objects, um, which would be its potential, things that it could expand into, and um, sort of this framework that surrounds the object based on its eternal qualities that it could evolve and transform using responding to its morphogenetic field. So this is a perspective looking at the crystal. Um, Another sort of tectonic arrangement that comes from the crystal architecture. Um, and then what we arrive at is this 12-dimensional, or I don't know if it was 12-dimensional, but this sort of matrix of geometry that has address points for each vertex and surface, um, each volume within a parametric system. The concept of a matrix becomes so important because um, the city is like a matrix, which is with its address points and its cellular qualities. Um, the matrix is often considered this like negative connotation for spiritual and human growth, but it actually had this flower of life or sacred geometry, 12-dimensional icosahedrons. They're all forms of matrices, and they're sort of definer axes of freedom and movement. Um, so uh, the matrix space and how we're able to articulate that through geometry uh, is probably one of the most ultimate potentials of geometry and architecture. It defines the exploration of knowledge and the exploration of environments within a matrix space, and this can all be driven through parametric algorithmic tools. The same concept of an algorithmic fractal geometry can create these schematic designs for cities. This is a mid-journey image using inspired from organic and biological systems, um, cellular biological systems. And they're also inspired by Borromini and sort of Baroque classical architectures that start to create these plans and schematics for cities or architecture. Also using AI to generate more of these city-like visualizations. And I also thought I'd include actual maps, satellite photography of cities so that we could sort of see what these remote sensing devices are able to capture of these environments. You could see their kind of cellular nature, their organic nature. And these are actually the platforms that create the future cities. Their creative environments, the sort of collective consciousness that is organized within the city is creating the city. It's this feedback loop of consciousness or this feedback loop of information where the city functions as a platform for creativity, which in turn creates more cities. And it's so interesting to see how these similar phenomena are happening all over the world. So we were just looking at Paris and then Barcelona. This is Los Angeles. This is London, um, Mexico City, uh, Athens, uh, Tokyo. Tokyo is interesting. It starts to look more like an organic cell versus the other more rigid formatted grids. Um, Munich has an interesting granularity at the block level. Each block is designed in a particular way, and they're color coded with performances. And so you could start to look at, again, the social program of the city at these scales, looking at industrial program and commercial corridors, um, inverted also. And also what I find that the hydrological system and related to the geological system is the best context and framework to describe the terrestrial reality. What sort of um, these hydrological paths define the health of the soil. So these contour and hydrological maps are a great basis for terrestrial models. This is a competition I recently entered, um, looking at the history of the Biono wetlands in Los Angeles and how they create this historical watershed, and then how this watershed intersects with the urban grid and creates this extremely interesting context for architecture to be born, and then how we can use abstract uh, sort of biological languages to create geometry, and how those can be built in relationship to a context, which is something I'm still exploring. Um, this is an AI image. The last image of sort of biological architecture is creating an environment to exist inside of. Um, so that will conclude my lecture. I appreciate everyone listening so much. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I would love to discuss with everyone.
Hey Jack, there was actually a question that came in the chat.
Oh, I
Uh,
wasn't able to see it.
yes, it said basically it was asking about the maps. May I know how these maps are generated, QGIS or RGIS, or
Mhm.
any other tool? Yeah.
Yeah, I work mostly in ArcMap. ArcMap generates the 2D maps. Some of the 3D models came from City Engine. So Esri has an amazing pipeline workflow to move data from ArcMap into City Engine, to create 3D models. I actually haven't really dove into QGIS yet, although I know there's all sorts of unique capacities in QGIS that ArcMap doesn't have. Yeah, I would like to have all the references you have worked on this book if you Yeah, there is a bibliography in the book. Yeah, which shows all the books I've read that can many great thinkers, you know, sharing ecosystem of thinkers that we're all sharing ideas with. Yeah. The another question is oh, there's two questions. Um Lovely lecture. I'd like to find more meaning in terms of how real can the system become the megastructures? How can we transition? And will the framework allow us to create more biosphere incentive? Um, that's a great comment. And I see the question below is also very related. Your architectural design approach is quite intriguing. Have you implemented this design language in any finalized projects? Most of my professional work within this I haven't hasn't resulted in built works. Although this is sort of a technical framework I'm developing for new types of projects, exploring, these geospatial tools and algorithmic tool sets for ways of generating architecture. And they haven't been built yet, or visualized yet. I mean, there's certain visualizations about the analysis of the environment, but yeah, they haven't been built yet. Um, Something I'm dreaming of still.
So Jack, this is
Yes, you're
Ziggy.
echoing. Yeah.
That's because Jesse and I are in the same room. This is a wonderful lecture, and for someone who is a big fan of yours, what I'm curious about is this work about community and agency for inner city people, understanding what you're trying to do, like this macro view that you have. And how do you see getting what you're doing to be part of the conversation of people who do not have your education or your just your experience, because it's so future thinking and yet so present at the same time. um, what do you see as your role in conveying this imaginary, but not even imaginary? I mean, it's so concrete. How do you connect the abstract to what's going on, having just driven through South Central Los Angeles 2 days ago? That's a big question. Thanks, Jack.
I'm just hoping that this can be empowering for people, that the book can be empowering as a method for um, everyone to see the potential within themselves to participate in the transformations that are happening around them through visualization, through imagination. Um, these tool sets allow us to visualize the future of our environment. And there's so many real projects happening. So I hope that, these methodologies I'm talking about can communicate with real projects, um, and affect the workflow that's happening for real projects that are being delivered. So real projects could happen within ecological, contextual, environmental analysis. Um, there's lots of comments coming through the.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Mhm. Um,
Well,
yeah,
I just wanted to say, oh,
yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I teach in South Central. I work a lot with Pico Union, and these systems of organizations are actually quite inspiring to the new generations to see that the system as it is not working for many. And when they intuitively or mathematically can connect, this has been extremely inspirational for some real projects that are developing, and some actually recently built near Leftover Freeway on Caltrans, where Jack implemented many of these mathematical and ecoverse constructs. So it's really incredible to see this presentation and the progress of the work.
Thank you, Mom.
So, first one being, will parametric design be an efficient solution towards economic, social, and ecological related issues, ranging from smaller projects such as residential projects to urban scale?
Yeah, I think the term parametric design has all sorts of branching phenomena happening right now. Even with AI design could be some branch of parametric design. So essentially, it's like different waves of generations of digital design. The point I was really trying to emphasize in the lecture was that mathematics, which is the basis for parametric design, is absolutely crucial for comprehending natural systems and then building in such a way that we are sort of using the intelligence of the biosphere in a way, I would say. So mathematics as creating value systems like the socio-economical balances that need to come into place, what can be measured. The first chapter in virtual community action planning, what I worked on with my father was like, what can be measured in the environment, right? So different distances to schools, different areas of land covered by green vegetation, tree canopy. What can be measured and what can we quantify about the environment? How can those become the parameters, parametricism? How can those become the parameters that drive our uh decision making? So, what can be measured? And maybe it's human happiness or enlightenment. Can we measure enlightenment? Could we measure there's all sorts of, especially with geospatial modeling where we're having haptic models of the environments, like everything's measured. So what are the actual uh goals and criteria for what we're building, I would say. Um and then how can we let the drivers of our designs come from these, concept like criteria in mind. No, that's the best answer I could come up with.
Lovely. There's another one. It looked like your recent competition project, including a design for some kind of a living infrastructure project, using which could be implemented using these principles. Is that the kind of human-made megastructure system that might result from this sort of thinking?
It's interesting. I often find myself in between sort of conceptual space and these real world spaces, or even drifting more towards the conceptual space. So the analysis in that project was very real, looking at the hydrological system and the watershed, um, and then how that might affect soil health and the existing infrastructures and the existing urban grid and how they're intersecting. That analysis is very real. My response when I sort of started to create these tension structures over the environment. Yeah, it's real. It could happen. Those are armatures for uh, greens, green architecture, right? You could create an armature for biological systems to grow on and sort of add to this conversation of green infrastructure. Um, so that's kind of what that project's referring to. But the transformation I'm more interested in happens through the community gathering that I was talking about with Ziggy, where people come together and work on these contextual models in a continuous life cycle, like data life cycle. So there's a continuous iterative approach where these environmental models exist and many people are working on them and contributing towards the transformation of the environment. Um, I find there's actually a ratio of like how much one person can compute and design at one time. That's why we actually have a history of building architecture at certain scales. Even all those maps were taken at a particular scale. So there's even a general scale in which cities operate. It was this 1 to 15,000 scale, which I believe was in meters. And um and so one person could have one ecological intervention, another person can have another ecological intervention. It's like, how do these things become visualized simultaneously in a shared model space and platforms? That's kind of what I'm talking about. Um, yeah.
Awesome. Then there's another one. I think this is a general question about graduating architects. Should they have a healthy balance of traditional architectural design and design using AI-based workflows or AI-based technologies as design inspiration? So, what do you have to comment on about that?
Um, I think my philosophy for architecture students and how they find their path has always been like like an inward journey. So whatever you find most inspiring and passionate about and what really sets your heart on fire, that's the direction you should take. And if it's making AI architecture, then dive in with full passion. If it's looking at more traditional architectural methods, you know, we still need all sorts of traditional architecture being built. Um, so there, I believe, you know, there's certain statistics at how much development is happening all over the world. There's room for all types of thinkers. It's just a matter of following what you're really passionate about.
Super nice. In continuation to the question, there's another one. So you mentioned AI giving us the power to make all of this possible. And with that power comes responsibility to come from a grounded or a spiritual place. Can you speak more on any new or upcoming AI that you're keeping an eye on?
Mm-hmm. So, I'm on LinkedIn often and Instagram, and I'm following, you know, I don't want to call out any names. I'm following many people and their experiments with AI and their visualizations, and I find that it's a lot of recycled content on like, um, let's say more commercial uses, um, luxury uses. I'm more interested in how AI can like interpret satellite imagery in these environmental systems than generate the next you know, villa or fancy house, right? There's so many fancy houses being generated on AI. And those are beautiful, and I love Frank Lloyd Wright, and he designed fancy houses. So but I'm more interested I'm looking at, okay, I will name one project. So there's a company called Planet. And they have the largest repository of satellites taking photographs of the Earth, and they recently partnered with Microsoft to use AI image interpretation, and I'm really curious what's going to happen with that, to answer directly. Yeah. Uh, I really appreciate all these questions and everyone being here, um, and listening and joining in for the ideas. I hope I was able to satisfy curiosity.
I had a question. Um, so it's kind of like an imaginary question, but if you could, I guess two questions. Like the practical version of the question would be: are there any Earth observation systems that are up and coming right now that you're really excited about that haven't really developed? Like I'm just thinking of, say, the way that you have some space photography in your book, and like spectral imaging of other stars and this kind of thing to look and find elements. So are there any Earth observation data that's kind of like you would love to be able to have access to? You made the sort of joke, like, can you measure enlightenment, like these subtle vibrations that we don't have instrumentation for yet, to say, look at something like the human energy field or the human magnetic field, or I mean, we have some like basic ability to record that kind of thing, but we don't have very refined instrumentation to study certain, energies. Are there, if you could imagine like a Earth observation instrument to gather more information, like what would you want to see next? You're seeing these contours of the Earth, you're seeing hydrology, like what's the system that you're like desperate to see next, if that's a question? And or are there instruments that are currently being developed that you're really excited about, like that are starting to show more information in terms of terrestrial observation, and or like AI computation that's starting to I guess be able to visualize or interpret or I guess model but really observation and modeling are different. So that are actually able to observe new layers of information that you think are really like pertinent to understanding terrestrial architecture.
I'm really excited about this concept of a diffusion structure. So the mathematics of a fractal allows for things to grow. And if you imagine like a growing forest or even just a flower growing and expanding, what I would like to see in these real-time feedback photographs are like visible transformations of our cities. So what that might look like from the satellite perspective, I'm not 100% sure, but maybe it's like more vegetation and more green. They start to look less gray and more green. In the most simple sense, if from the satellite perspectives, our cities were less gray and more green. And maybe also more open space. Everything's so dense. So if things started to clear out, I think that would represent like people taking more time to slow down and go into that inward journey you were talking about. And perhaps, things would become more colorful, even just besides green. Um, yeah, so uh, if I were able to like transfer what's in my imagination to all these people on the Zoom calls, like if you could watch certain animations on my website under mathematical forms of like these tessellating, aggregating fractals, cities are in this dynamic space of evolution. So if I could visualize within like cities transforming into more healthy versions of themselves in a type of like continuous evolving and mutating state until they're um what's the highest form of enlightenment and what's the highest vision of a city. I have ideas of those, and that those are well recorded in spiritual texts and um the crystal city and these mandirs that become the size of cities, but the sort of transitional state and ever evolving state of that, I think, is super exciting. What that looks like from the God's eye perspective, right? Makes life exciting.
I was going to suggest as well is that we can move on to the after party. We can all talk to one another there and hang out in metaverse space. Let them come back and we can go with that. Maybe Vamsi could show where that space could be found on our platform. And actually, there's the link in the chat right now, but it's also available on the platform right away, exactly where you managed to join this meeting from Futurely directly. I hope everyone's having a good time, and I hope today was valuable. I just want to remind everyone one last time to use your full name, first name and last name that you're using on Futurely, so we can roll out the giveaway right after this event. And the giveaway, by the way, is as an amazing course taught by Jack himself, and it's about fractal architecture. It's a portion of his book that shows how he did all those amazing fractal geometries, and I think it would give you a let's say an insight to his brain. By going through this course, you will go through a journey with him. So that would be I think that would be a great experience for you. Ramsey?
Yes. So guys, if you have logged in and joined the Zoom session, I will quickly share my screen. You should find another button right below the live session. Just give me a moment, please. Yes. So if you notice my screen here, so we have the Zoom session, and right underneath it, we have the after party, which is in spatial. And all you need to do is hit play, and you can directly join live on the session here, and we can walk around, take a lovely look at the exhibition that Jack has curated for us with all of his work from terrestrial architecture. We can also continue the conversation that we are having here. So people can tune in directly live there, and you can also ask your questions here, guys, and we can take the session there. Now that Jack is back. Jack,
Thank you so much, Jack, by the way, and
Yeah.
congrats once again for the book. And thanks for letting us host this for you. And really also thanks for the nice metaverse virtual experience that you put together for us, that we can't wait to go in and have a social virtual experience.
That's great.
I'm trying to avoid the word metaverse at all costs. That's the thing.
An immersive experience.
An immersive experience.
Yes.
Thank you to everyone, and thank you Futurely. I'll see you guys in the immersive experience.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jack. And thank you so much for everyone for tuning in and sticking around.